Hey guys, Mrs. Erickson here. So this in the background is Crown Center at Christmas time. Pretty, something different. So we are ready for chapter 5. Chapter 4 ended with Buck being led by different humans, a Scottish guy, and they are running them to death. They're not getting very many breaks, and so we're going to pick up there. Chapter 5, the toil of trace and trail. 30 days from the time it left Dawson, the saltwater mail with Buck and his mates at 4 arrived at Skagway. They were in a wretched state, worn out and worn down. Buck's 140 pounds had dwindled to 115. The rest of his mates, though lighter dogs, had relatively lost more weight than he. Pike, the maligner, who in his lifetime of deceit had often successfully fined a hurt leg, was now limping in earnest. Solex was limping, and Dub was suffering from a wrenched shoulder blade. They were all terribly footsore. No spring or rebound was left in them. Their feet fell heavily on the trail, jarring their bodies and doubling the fatigue of the day's travel. There was nothing the matter with them except that they were dead tired. It was not the dead tiredness that comes through brief and excessive effort, from which recovery is a matter of hours, but it was the dead tiredness that comes through the slow and prolonged strength drainage of months of toil. There was no power of recuperation left, no reserve strength to call upon. It had been all used, the least bit of it. Every muscle, every fiber, every cell was tired, dead tired, and there was reason for it. In less than 5 months, they had traveled 2,500 miles during the last 1,800, of which they had had but 5 days' rest. When they arrived at Skagway, they were apparently on their last legs. They could barely keep the traces taut, and on the downgrades, just managed to keep out of the way of the sled. "Mush on, poor sore feets," the driver encouraged them as he trotted down the main street of Skagway. "Dis is de last. Den we get one long rest, eh? For sure, one bully long rest." The drivers confidently expected a long stopover. Themselves, they had covered 1,200 miles in 2 days. And in the nature of reason and common sense, they deserved an interval of loafing. But so many were the men who had rushed into the Klondike, and so many were the sweethearts, wives, and kin that had not rushed in, that the congested mail was taking on alpine proportions. Also, there were official orders. Fresh batches of Hudson Bay dogs were to take the places of those worthless for the trail. The worthless ones were to be got rid of, and since dogs count for little against dollars, they were to be sold. 3 days passed, by which time Buck and his mates found how really tired and weak they were. Then, on the morning of the 4th day, 2 men from the States came along and bought them, harness and all, for a song. The men addressed each other as Hal and Charles. Charles was a middle-aged, lightish-colored man with weak and watery eyes and a mustache that twisted fiercely and vigorously up, giving the lie to the limply drooping lips it concealed. Hal was a youngster of 19 or 20, with a big Colt revolver and a hunting knife strapped about him on the belt that fairly bristled with cartridges. This belt was the most salient thing about him. It advertised his callowness, a callowness sheer and unutterable. Both men were manifestly out of place, and why such as they should adventure the north is part of the mystery of things that passes understanding. Buck heard the chaffering, saw the money pass between man and the government agent, and knew that the Scottish half-breed and the mail train drivers were passing out of this life on the heels of Perrault and Francois, and the others who had gone before. When driven with his mates to the new owner's camp, Buck saw a slipshod and slovenly affair. Tents half sketched, dishes unwashed, everything in disorder. Also, he saw a woman, Mercedes, the men called her. She was Charles's wife and Hal's sister, a nice family party. Buck watched them apprehensively as they proceeded to take down the tents and load the sled. There was a great deal of effort about their manner, but no businesslike method. The tent was rolled into an awkward bundle 3 times as large as it should have been. The tin dishes were packed away unwashed. Mercedes continually fluttered in the way of her men and kept up an unbroken chattering of remonstrance and advice. Then they put a cloth sack on the front of the sled. She suggested it should go on the back, and when they had put it in on the back and covered it over with a couple of other bundles, she discovered overlooked articles, which could abide nowhere else but in that sack, and they unloaded again. 3 men from the neighboring tent came out and looked on, grinning and winking at one another. "You've got a right smart load as it is," said one of them, "and it's not me should tell you your business, but I wouldn't tote that tent along if I was you." "Undreamed of," cried Mercedes, throwing up her hands in dainty dismay. "However in the world could I manage without a tent?" It's springtime, and you won't get any more cold weather," the man replied. She shook her head decidedly, and Charles and Hal put the last odds and ends on top of the mountainous load. "Think it'll ride?" one of the men asked. "Why shouldn't it?" Charles demanded rather shortly. "Oh, that's all right. That's all right," the man hastened meekly to say. I was just a wondering, that's all. It seems a mite top heavy." Charles turned his back and drew the lashing down as well as he could, which was not in the least well. "And of course the dogs could hike along all day with the contraption behind them," affirmed a second of the men. "Certainly," said Hal with freezing politeness, taking hold of the gee-pole with one hand and swinging his whip from the other. "Mush!" he shouted. "Mush on there!" The dogs sprang against the breastbands, strained hard for a few moments, then relaxed. They were unable to move the sled. "The lazy brutes! I'll show 'em!" he cried, preparing to lash out at them with the whip. But Mercedes interfered, crying, "Oh, Hal, you mustn't!" as she caught hold of the whip and wrenched it from him. "The poor dears! Now you must promise you won't be harsh with them for the rest of the trip, or I won't go a step." "Precious lot you know about dogs," her brother sneered, "and I wish you'd leave me alone. They're lazy, I tell you, and they've got to whip them to get anything out of them. That's their way. You ask anyone as one of those men." Mercedes looked at them imploringly, untold repugnance at sight of pain written on her pretty face. "They're weak as water, if you want to know," came the reply from one of the men. "Plumb tuckered out. That's what's the matter. They need a rest." "Rest be blanked," said Hal, with his beardless lips, and Mercedes said, "Oh," in pain and sorrow at the oath. But she was a clammish creature, and rushed at once to the defense of her brother. "Never mind that man," she said pointedly. "You're driving our dogs, and you do what you think best with them." Again, Hal's whip fell upon the dogs. They threw themselves against the breastbands, dug their feet into the packed snow, got down low to it, and put forth all their strength. The sled held as though it were an anchor. After 2 efforts, they stood still, panting. The whip was whistling savagely, when once more Mercedes interfered. She dropped on her knees before Buck with tears in her eyes and put her arms around his neck. "You poor, poor dear," she cried sympathetically. "Why don't you pull hard? Then you won't be whipped." Buck did not like her, but he was feeling too miserable to resist her, taking it as part of the day's miserable work. One of the onlookers, who had been clenching his teeth to suppress hot speech, now spoke up. "It's not that I care what belongs to you, but of those dogs' sake, I just want to tell you, you can help them a mighty lot by breaking out that sled. The runners are frozen fast. Throw your weight against the gee-pole right and left and break it out." The 3rd time the attempt was made, but this time, following the advice, Hal broke out the runners, which had been frozen to the snow. The overloaded and unwieldy sleigh forged ahead. Buck and his mate struggled frantically under the rail of blows. 100 yards ahead, the path turned and sloped steeply to the main street. It would have required an experienced man to keep the top-heavy sled upright, and Hal was not such a man. As they swung on the turn, the sled went over, spilling half its load through the loose lashings. The dogs nearly never stopped. The lightened sled bounded on its side behind them. They were angry because of the ill treatment they had received and the unjust load. Buck was raging. He broke into a run. The team followed his lead. Hal cried, "Whoa, whoa!" But he gave no heed. He tripped and was pulled off his feet. The capsized sled ground under him, and the dogs dashed on up the street, adding to the gaiety of Sagway as they scattered the remainder of the outfit along its chief thoroughfare. Kind-hearted citizens caught the dogs and gathered up the scattered belongings. Also, they gave advice. Half the load and twice the dogs, if they were expected to reach Dawson, was what was said. Hal and his sister and brother-in-law listened unwillingly, pitched tent, and overhauled the outfit. Canned goods were turned out that made men laugh, for canned goods on the long trail is a thing to dream about. Blankets for a hotel, quoth one of the men who laughed and helped. Half as many is too much. Get rid of them. Throw away the tent and all those dishes. Who's going to wash them anyway? Good Lord, do you think you're traveling on a Pullman? And so it went, the inexorable elimination of the superfluous. Mercedes cried when her clothes bags were dumped on the ground and article after article was thrown out. She cried in general, and she cried in particular over each discarded thing. She clasped hands about knees, rocking back and forth brokenheartedly. She averred she would not go an inch, not for a dozen Charleses. She appealed to everybody and to everything, finally wiping her eyes and proceeding to cast out even articles of apparel that were imperative necessities. And in her zeal, when she had finished with her own, she attacked the belongings of the men and went through them like a tornado. Okay, we're going to stop there. This is a pretty long chapter, so we got about a third of the way through, and we will get the next third tomorrow. Have a great day, guys.